Welcome to Street Knowledge with Chris Graham.
Donald Trump, with his anti-DEI orders, has us once again fighting over the crumbs. Chris Graham, Augusta Free Press. So DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, is, quote, immoral per Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, a white man born in the millions, whose father bought him an Ivy League degree and then gave him a $400 million head start in the business world, thinks diversity, equity, and inclusion is immoral. Interesting word choice there, coming from a guy with 34 felony fraud convictions, hundreds of millions of dollars in judgments for fraud and defamation. The lack of self-awareness from Donald Trump here, stunning. We have this guy who was born on third base and thinks it was because he hit a triple, claiming he wants everyone else to have to compete in a thumb on the scale meritocracy that benefits the already advantaged, like him. Here's a quote from his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. President Trump campaigned on ending the scourge of DEI from our federal government and returning America to a merit-based society where people are hired based on their skills, not for the color of their skin. This is another win for Americans of all races, religions, and creeds. Promises made, promises kept. Bless her heart. She was speaking there in defense of the executive order signed by Trump on DEI and diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility DEIA mandates, policies, programs, preferences, and activities in the federal government under whatever name they appear. His executive order terminating DEI, DEIA. I love the language there in this statement from our taxpayer-funded PR flunky about people are hired based on their skills, not the color of their skin. That's just adorable coming from somebody working for Donald Trump, who pretends to be a self-made man, though his only skill is being born into wealth. Now, a follow-up executive order from Trump revoked a directive dating back to Lyndon B. Johnson. And you have to think about your history books. Most of you watching this, Lyndon B. Johnson, president from 1963 to 1969, he had an executive order on the books that required government contractors to adopt non-discriminatory practices in hiring and employment. So if you're wondering what's really motivating Trump here, yeah, he's back in the White House because he convinced white people that blacks, Latinos, and LGBTQs are getting all the good jobs because of DEI, when in reality, all we've been trying to do as a society for the past 60 years is give everybody a fair shot at good paying jobs. Now, let's be real here. Trump's history tells us he doesn't care if anybody gets a good paying job as long as he's taken care of. The family wealth that he was born into was the result of the paterfamilias, Fred Trump, skimming money from federal government affordable housing projects meant to benefit GIs returning from World War II, and then he built on his ill-gotten profit margins by stiffing his employees at every opportunity. Now, credit to Donald Trump, he learned at the feet of the master, and he's been stiffing the people who did the work on the few buildings he's actually been able to see to completion for decades. Pro tip, that's how you cook the books to get out from under multiple bankruptcies. What he's really doing here with these executive orders is giving preference with our tax dollars to his cronies so they can fleece the federal treasury the way his father did to make his mint. Now, this hurts us, not helps us. I get it that it does me no good to call foul on this because it is what it is. This is the law of the land for the next 4 years. Just need you to know this is setting all of us back, not just the black folks, the Latinos, the Asians, the women, the LGBTQs, who can now again be legally discriminated against in terms of hiring and the awards of federal contracts. We're all better off if we're all better off, if we're all able to be the best versions of who we can be. This is something that has motivated my entire life as a journalist. Now, I'm a white male, but I'm also the product of a hardscrabble background. I was born to teen parents, grew up in a rural trailer park in a single parent household on food stamps and free school lunches. Say all you want that I got out on merit, but I had to work a million times harder than the kids who grew up in middle class and upper middle class backgrounds in Northern Virginia just to get the same opportunities they had. And a lot of the kids that I grew up with who could and should be doing more with their lives are less than they should be just because the obstacles were too high. Because of what I've experienced, I have a tiny bit of insight into how hard it is to have the deck stacked against you. especially if you're an ethnic or racial minority, or if your obstacles are being a woman in a society that doesn't view women as equals, or an LGBTQ in a world that would rather you don't even exist. If all of us, if rural whites, if blacks, Latinos, and Asians, if women and LGBTQs can be the best version of us that we can be, that makes America better, makes us all richer, both in terms of money and every way else you can be. Now, I'm obscuring what the real motivation here is for Trump. What Donald Trump is selling about DEI being, quote, immoral is a throwback to the racial and gender politics of the Old South, where the political elites exploited rural whites by making them believe that their enemy was blacks who wanted to come take their jobs, and not the elites themselves who wanted to keep both poor whites and blacks in a box so they could exploit them as cheap labor. Of course, blacks weren't allowed to vote, so the whole strategy was let's get the rural whites to vote for us so that we can keep them in a box. We already got the black folks in a box with Jim Crow, right? There's a straight line here from slavery to Jim Crow to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy to the Reagan Democrats all the way to today's MAGA. It's the same thing. DEI is, well, it was, it's past tense for now, a small concession to trying to address the massive wealth and income inequality that the infamous Reagan tax cuts wrought. Fact. The top 1% now hold more than 30% of the wealth in this country. The bottom 50% hold 2.6%. So 1% of the people in this country hold 30% of the wealth. 50% hold 2.6%. DEI is just crumbs. And Trump, by making what ails us as a country being about DEI, he has us fighting over the crumbs while the wealthy elites grab more and more from the bounty. Mark Warner voted for the Laken Riley Act. He must be gearing up for a Senate re-election run. Chris Graham here, Augusta Free Press. Your first indication that Mark Warner is planning to run for re-election is that vote for the Laken Riley Act, the pretend get tough on immigration bill that will allow the Trump administration to go after DACAs, the Dreamers, and people under temporary protected status protections. Here's a quote from Warner, trying to sound as Republican as he possibly can. The loss of Lake and Riley was a heartbreaking reminder of the need to strike a balance between keeping our communities safe and ensuring that our immigration system is both humane and effective. All right. How does this bill do that? He was one of the 12 Democrats who voted to pass the bill, which will allow the feds to detain and deport immigrants without legal status for arrest for even low-level misdemeanors, even if no charges are ultimately waged against them. You can see how this would and ultimately will be abused. Local cops are going to be empowered to participate in mass immigrant sweeps using this legislation as the authorization that won't have to pass judicial scrutiny. Here's a quote from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These are the people that want you to believe and want us to believe that they are keeping violent criminals off the streets. That's what they want you to believe. The House voted on Wednesday to pass the Senate version of the bill with 46 Republicans voting, or 46 Democrats joining Republicans voting the majority, I should say. The bill now goes to Trump, and we all know what's going to happen with that. He's going to get his Sharpie out and get this thing going. The frustrating thing here is with Mark Warner voting yes, he even acknowledged in his statement that the bill has flaws. Here's a quote. While I ultimately voted to support this legislation, I also acknowledge it is imperfect and could have been improved by amendments I supported to streamline its enforcement mechanisms and target the most dangerous criminals. Continuing with Warner's quote, as we work to improve our immigration system, I remain committed to finding common ground that holds criminals accountable while protecting the ideals that define us as a nation. Uh, Finishing up here, he's trying to play both sides. America and Virginia have been made stronger by many immigrants. I will continue to hold the administration answerable for executing all the laws faithfully and fairly in accordance with our values in the Constitution. Fat chance of that happening with Donald Trump being the guy executing them faithfully and fairly, sure. Advice here to Warner, talking out of both sides of your mouth doesn't fool anybody. In other words, Republican voters are still going to assume you're a George Soros-funded communist and vote for whoever, literally whoever the Republicans put up, convicted felon or otherwise, in 2026. And on something like this, here's the other warning, I guess I could say. The Democrats who've been sending you back to Washington every few years are going to be less enthused to do so again. I'm not going to say they're going to vote against you. They're just not going to put signs in their yards and go out and knock on doors. I mean, because What's the difference? You are the Republican in this sense. Radical centrist is going to radical centrist, I guess. Now, for another way to do this, we wrap up here with a statement from Jennifer McClellan, a Democrat who represents Virginia's 4th District in Congress. This one's got some meat to it, so give me a second. Quote, last Congress, congressional leadership negotiated a strong bipartisan immigration reform bill to secure the southern border. We were fully prepared to advance this legislation, but Donald Trump urged his conference to kill the bill for political reasons. Now, congressional Republicans seek to exploit Laken Riley's tragic death as a means to pass this overreaching anti-immigrant legislation. Under current law, any undocumented immigrant arrested or convicted of a felony can be detained without bail and deported. This bill goes even further to mandate detention and deportation of any undocumented immigrant merely charged with or arrested for certain crimes, even if charges are dropped or they are found not guilty. This bill clearly oversteps and undermines due process, paving the way for immigrants to be deported without regard to innocence or guilt. Wild idea here. Maybe Jennifer McClellan should run for Warner's seat in the 2026 cycle. We finally heard from our MAGA Congressman Ben Cline on the issue of President Trump's inexcusable pardons of the 1,500 J6ers who tried to overturn the 2020 presidential election to keep their dear leader in power. Here's a quote from Ben Cline. Our officer Alan Gibson served our Commonwealth with dedication for 2 years before tragically losing his life in a line of duty. He wrote that on Twitter on Tuesday. Hold on. I'm being told this isn't Klein raising issue with Trump freeing the J6ers. Okay, here's more from that tweet. It's unacceptable that the individuals charged with his murder were granted clemency by President Biden. There we have it. This was Klein joining Governor Glenn Youngkin and Attorney General Jason Miyares, going full racist dog whistle after Biden, on his way out the door over the weekend, granted clemency to two innocent black men who were serving life sentences connected to the murder of a white police officer that even a jury said they didn't commit. Here's an idea. Why not just go on live TV and shout the N-word at the top of your lungs, guys? The case that Klein thinks needs addressing days later involves Terrence Richardson and Ferone Claiborne. We've talked about this on a recent video. Their crime was being black, and thus very loosely fitting the description of whoever it was that killed Officer Gibson, who was 25 years old during a 1998 drug bust in Waverly down in Sussex County. Gibson was shot and killed with a service weapon during a drug bust, and according to court records, he was able to describe his attackers to responding officers. He described one as a tall and skinny black man with dreadlocks, and the other as a black man who was balding and short. Now, Richardson, then 27, and Claiborne, then 22, were arrested because they're black. Police identified Richardson as the tall and skinny shooter that Gibson had described, though he is only 5'8", and therefore he was several inches shorter than Gibson. So that's kind of weird that a person much taller than a 5'8" guy would say this 5'8" guy was tall and skinny. And then also it stands out that Richardson wore his hair in cornrows, not dreadlocks. So, we all kind of know the difference between cornrows and dreadlocks. Claiborne, meanwhile, he did fit Gibson's description as bald, but he is 4 inches taller than Richardson. So he's 4 inches taller than the tall, skinny black guy, and he was the short one? Okay. But they're black. That was close enough, apparently. There was no DNA evidence linking him to the scene. It would later emerge that police coerced a witness into saying she saw the shooting, that Richardson shot Gibson, even though she would testify in court later that she had been coerced into saying that. The two took a plea deal offered by the local prosecutor, because basically the local prosecutor, the local police, the Virginia State Police said that they would not get a conviction in the case, and they were trying to save face. And the plea deal was offered, and the guys took it because they were running out of money. Because unless you're O.J. Simpson and you're black, you don't have the ability to hire the dream team. You hire whoever you can hire, and at some point, you don't have any more money left to pay the guy. The plea deal became controversial locally, and the U.S. attorney got involved and tried them under a federal statute. That's how you can get around double jeopardy. Just try them under instead of state law, you try them under federal law. A jury still acquitted them of the murder, but the judge sentenced the guys to life anyway because the jury did find them guilty on a drug charge in that case. Now, the drug charges should have gotten them a max of 10 years, but the judge just decided to give them life because he could, he decided. Now, they've been in prison since 2001 for a crime they did not commit. But to Ben Klein, the real hostages are the J6ers who we've all seen on video mercilessly beating cops, threatening to hang Vice President Mike Pence, trying to break through barricades to get at top congressional leaders. And if they were going to hang Mike Pence, you can just guess what they were going to do to Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Now, to be fair, Klein hasn't called the J6ers hostages. That's the word used by Trump as he issued the pardons on Monday, ahead of having his press office put out a statement, also calling the prosecution and incarceration of the 1,500 J6ers a quote, grave injustice. Klein has just exercised his right to remain silent on the sheer gall of the guy that he hitched his political wagon to, letting the actual cop killers free. And you can argue with me on this all day long, but in addition to the 174 police officers who were injured on January 6th, Brian Sicknick died the next day from a stroke. Four others died later by suicide. Five cop five cops died that day, and 1,500 people who participated in their murders are now free. Now, here's a funny thing to note. 92% of the J6ers are white. Now, I wonder if that has anything to do with Klein, Youngkin, and Miyares not only remaining silent on the J6 pardons, but then trying to divert attention away from J6 by pointing at two innocent black guys from Waverly. White guys killing cops in the name of Donald Trump, that's okay by Ben Klein, Glenn Youngkin, and Jason Miyares. Black guys in jail because they very loosely fit the description of black guys who killed a cop, also okay by Ben Klein, Glenn Youngkin, and Jason Miyares.